Welcome to Hear Me Out. I'm your host, Spencer Demetros. Today we're going to explore the wonderful and beautiful world of landscape design and garden construction with our guest, Rochelle Greayer. Rochelle is a nationally celebrated, best-selling author, TV personality, and expert in landscape design and garden construction. For over 5 years, Rochelle hosted the leading plant show on the Home Shopping Network, and these days is continuing to develop her extensive catalog of incredibly informative online courses and providing expert guidance on landscape design and garden construction on her website, Pith and Vigor. So we are honored to have you as a guest on our show today. So thanks for coming on, Rochelle.
Sure, it'll be fun.
So one thing I was surprised to learn when I looked at your background was that you started out your career as an engineer at Hughes Aircraft.
Right.
So tell us a little bit about how you transitioned from aerospace engineer to professional in the landscape design arena.
Yeah. Well, when I was a kid, I with no irony, as you do when you're a kid, I told everybody I wanted to be an astronaut when I grew up, and I meant it though. I really did pursue that. I went to RPI for aeronautical engineering. I became a pilot. I kind of really went for it. And my first job out of college was, I was even in the Navy for a little while. My first job out of college was working for Hughes Aircraft on F-18 flight simulators.
Wow.
So, which was super cool. There are these huge, amazing, 40-foot domes and really interesting, just, real cockpit sort of stuff. Anyway, and I also worked on satellites, and the whole space thing was what got me into that sort of realm. It wasn't that I was because it was as a software engineer.
Sure.
I never wanted to be a software engineer. But that, you kind of get into it, and the application is one thing, and the day-to-day of being a software engineer is another thing. And
Sure.
so wasn't my favorite thing. But I carried on with that for a number of years, kind of as I, moved along and you get promoted, enjoying my job less and less, until actually I was living in England and working for Nortel Networks at the time, and they were kind of famously imploding, the whole company. They kind of, it was 2000 or 2001 or something like that, and they kind of literally, I was on this campus in London, England, where they had hired me to, and moved my husband and I there. And they were closing the whole thing. 20,000 people losing their job, kind of thing. So I was in the midst of this massive layoff, and I didn't know what to do, and I was in a foreign country, and I kind of was really demotivated to look for another software engineering job. And happened to be May, actually this week, by the way, is the Chelsea Flower Show in England, and so it's 20. This is an anniversary week, 20 whatever years ago this week. I went to the Chelsea Flower Show because I was I'm on. They call it gardening leave in England when you get laid off and you're in between jobs.
Yes.
It's called gardening leave.
Right.
Anyway, I was on gardening leave, and I had nothing better to do, so I went to the show. I lived in the area, and it truly changed my life. And the reason for that was, I've been a gardener my whole life. My family, I'm from Colorado. My mom and her whole family is from Montana as ranchers. My dad and his whole family are farmers from Kansas. I grew up in Denver. But I have these people who, all of my family are people who live straight off the land kind of thing, and
Sure.
big gardeners and all of that. And it was just my childhood. We ate vegetables from our garden. My mom was the garden club president. That was I never considered it as a career, though. Never. I don't even think I heard the term landscape architecture as a kid. It just was a way of life. Until I went to the Chelsea Flower Show, and I saw there's actually an industry, and you can have a job and a living, and so I felt like I was kind of halfway there, because it was just sort of a way of life for me all along. And now I see it through the eyes of England culture, which
Sure.
is very different, very much more garden focused, and had these revelations. There's movie stars hanging around at the Chelsea Flower Show. It is it's cool to be a gardener. It's everybody's into it. It takes over primetime television on multiple channels for a whole week. It's just a really big thing there, and it was so inspiring. I literally signed up for design school that day. I had this like package of, the layoff package. And I was
Sure.
like, well, that's where it's going to go.
Yeah.
I'm going to change careers. And yeah, the rest is history.
And then you moved back to the U.S. from there to
a few years later. I went to
India.
school for design in England, and I started my business. I even did a show garden at the Hampton Court Palace, which is one of the two big.
So you stayed in England.
We stayed in England for a couple of years. Rob, my husband's job, he was able to. We were able to patch together the visas, and then he continued. So yeah, we were there for a couple more years after that. I started my business there, and then, I think it was 2.5 or 3 years later. It was 3. We ultimately lived there for 4 years, and so this whole thing happened within the first 6 months of arriving.
Jeez.
So yeah.
I give you credit. These days it's not unheard of for people to kind of leave a career that they've invested a lot of, many years and their education to kind of follow their passion. But, back then that was a little less common, but it took a lot of courage to kind of, leave a profession that was just such a, obviously a very well-respected field, aerospace engineering, and do something like that. So I give you a lot of credit, and it worked out.
It worked out.
Good for you.
It definitely did.
So let's jump right into it. It's spring. People are hopefully getting out in their yards and getting into the dirt, and some people are buying, moving into new homes. Mm-hmm. Let's talk to maybe a person who maybe just bought their first home or wanting to start their first garden. What kind of overarching, do you have any basic piece of advice you'd have for somebody who is starting their first garden?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that people tend to do is they get overwhelmed immediately. And they get overwhelmed for lots of reasons. One, because they don't know a lot about gardening, and it's like they're looking at a piece of land, however big it is, and thinking they have to like address the whole thing all at once.
Yeah.
And there's maybe looking at a weedy patch and an overgrown patch, and we don't have a place to sit outside, or like, and they have all of these things, like, and it's a lot of things to disentangle. I mean, that's kind of like, that's why a lot of people hire a garden designer or somebody,
Sure.
a professional like myself, to help them disentangle that. And, I offer courses for that. But I think the biggest key is to don't take on too much. And the reason for that is a lot of people, they look at it and they have a yard, it's a plot,
Right.
and they think they have to address all of it immediately. And what happens is they spend a whole lot of money,
Right.
if they can, or as much as they can, doing things like clearing or planting big pieces of grass or whatever, and they think they're done, which they're not. The more you do, the more you have to maintain, and it's kind of like people get in over their heads so fast. I always tell people, just go carve out the closest area to your house first.
Right.
Don't feel like you have to do like the back 40 right away.
Yeah.
Like, get this good, and then
Right.
iteratively move out. Because what you're going to do in that little area is you're going to start to figure out what you like, figure out what you want.
Right.
You're going to start to learn some new skills of maintaining it. You're going to understand how much time you have, or
Right.
whether you even want to maintain gardens, because sometimes people don't want to.
It's so funny you're
and
saying
you,
this,
You
'cause-
do all this stuff, and then quickly a lot of people feel like, I did all this stuff and now I can't maintain it, and it was all a waste, because
Yeah.
it'll quickly kind of
That's
go
so
out of
interesting,
control.
because that's exactly what I did. It was exactly what you said. Like, when we bought our house, it was in the middle of like the deep, dense forest, and we cleared like
Right.
an acre. You've seen it.
Yep,
Cleared
yep.
an acre and a half, and I thought, all right, so we, spent oodles of money getting rid of the ledge and the trees and everything else. The lawn was done, so I'm like,
Yeah.
all right, let me just put the gardens in.
Yeah.
So I put in like 7 gardens, and I thought, all right, I'm going to just kill myself for the next year or two, get them all
Yeah.
in, and I'm only going to put in perennials, so they'll come back every year.
Yeah, yeah.
So once it's done, it's done, and I could just
never
enjoy
done.
my garden. And it was too much,
Yeah.
So now it's like I didn't realize how much effort
Yes.
maintaining a garden is.
It is.
It's just unbelievable.
Well,
So,
and you're really proud of it. Like once you
Yeah.
put it all in,
Yeah.
you want it to look,
Right.
as good or better than it did, when those plants all arrived from the nursery the first day and they're maybe babies and you're excited for
Yeah.
them to get bigger and fill in or whatever you want. But if you don't maintain it and, take care of them, they're not going to get there.
It's
Even the
embarrassing, yeah.
watering, the
Right.
watering is difficult. People, a lot of times with clients, I'll be like, look, these new baby plants, they need watered every day
Yeah.
for like a month
Right,
at least.
right.
And then, you can take it down to every few days. You're not, yes, they're low maintenance plants, maybe they're drought tolerant plants or something,
Yeah.
but they're not really drought tolerant until they're
Yeah, at
rooted
least a year
in.
or two in.
And that's
Exactly.
going to take solidly a season
Right.
potentially, maybe even, a year or
Right.
more, of like pandering to these little,
Right.
it's like, they're like children,
Exactly. I
like
learned
babies
that-
need a lot of work and they get easier
Yeah.
as they grow up. You don't need to be
It's
right
funny,
there quite as much. But
Mistake number one was, like you said, biting off more than you can chew.
Mm-hmm.
Number two was dealing with the water situation. I don't know how you feel about drip lines. So I thought I could fix the water problem by putting drip lines in all my gardens, which was
Okay.
a disaster. It was
Really? Why
yeah.
is that?
I think because gardens aren't static. Like they're always in
Oh, right.
motion, right? So
Right.
you're always moving stuff, and you're just in the
right.
garden a lot. And it's
Yeah,
like
yeah.
every time I put my shovel in, it was like I hit one of those stupid rubber hoses. So I felt like I was just confined. So I
Right.
finally I just ripped them all out. I ripped them all out,
Right.
cut them into little pieces.
Right.
It's very gratifying.
Oh, that's really funny.
And I didn't cut them into pieces just out of like just to be vengeful. I actually had to
Yeah.
do that so I can like throw them in the garbage because the trash man wouldn't take them with big
Oh,
hoses.
gosh, yeah.
But anyway, for me, it didn't work out.
Yeah.
The drip hoses.
Yeah, I think they can be really great. They're as far as irrigation goes, they're definitely the more effective way of delivering water to your plants. But yeah, if you're constantly in it and changing it up,
Yeah.
it's like dig safe for the water lines. Like you're
Yeah.
gonna be constantly,
Yeah.
and it's a pain in the neck. Yeah, I hear you.
So, we live in a very there's difficult terrain here. It's very rocky soil. It's, the weather could be harsh in the spring. Just generally, what are the kind of geographical factors people should consider when designing their landscape, their backyards, their gardens?
Yeah. So there's the typical things that everybody knows, like hardiness zones, which, are very, around here we're like 6, 5, 6. Maybe if you're closer into Boston, you're 7. But that's kind of the range. If you go more north, you'll get down into 4s and 3s. And the hardiness zones are put out by the USDA. And you'll see that on plant tags. So you always want to make sure you're, not trying to grow plants that really can't survive this weather. So, like a zone 9 or 10 plant here in New England is really just going to be an annual, whereas it might be a perennial, in zone 9 or 10, for example. So you always want to pay attention to the hardiness zones. Lately, people are becoming more and more aware of ecoregions. And here in New England, we have a lot of ecoregions. Ecoregions speak more to sort of naturally occurring ecologies. So we have, like a coastal ecoregion where certain types of plants really survive and thrive better closer to like salt marshes and the coast. As we move out here into Acton, Harvard, and whatever, we start to get a little bit more elevation. There's different ecoregions. Some of them are very small. So there are probably at least a dozen ecoregions that are just here in the local New England area. So this is kind of a newer thing for people to get aware of. But as a lot of people are very interested in planting more native plants and things that, kind of help pollinators and wildlife and the whole ecosystem, and knowing your ecoregion.
Sure.
What that's, just understanding, like, what is it that makes my little area very special? Like, I live in Harvard, and we live right on a fault line of I forget what it's called, the Shrewsbury Fault Line. And there's literally like a cliff between my house and the house behind us. And that is like the fault line. And there's, even that one little bit has, because there's this like 20 or 30 foot cliff, that protected area underneath there historically, allowed for a lot of plants that basically don't grow anywhere else in New England can thrive in this like kind of protected under the cliff area.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. So this is a very much more nuanced thing than like, you know, a lot of gardeners have particularly thought of. But in general, you know, most gardeners are like hardiness zones, you know, that kind of thing. But
I think some of the nuanced stuff actually, you know, has a very direct effect on what plants can thrive and not. And it's interesting what you just said, which is you can actually have a neighbor with different conditions than you might have based on factors that you might not even really fully understand.
Yeah.
Like it's funny around here, you know, when I was going in the garden shop, they would talk about certain plants as, you know, foolhardy, right? You can't mess these up.
Right.
You know, one was Shasta daisies, one was black-eyed Susans. I can't grow Shasta daisies or black-eyed Susans on my property and I don't know why.
Oh, that's interesting.
And some of the more, I guess, fragile plants thrive on my property. So it has something to do with the soil composition or something.
Some sort of, we call it microclimates. So, you know, and you can really manipulate microclimates. You have microclimates already. So, you know, just the way the wind might be like coming around your house, the prevailing wind comes one way, your house is situated, you might be creating a pocket of warmer air or cooler air or air that moves or doesn't move. You know, all these things different plants will, you know, have a preference for.
Right.
This morning I happened to be, I love the Lyman greenhouses down in Waltham. And I was looking up something related to that, and I happened upon a thing I'd never even paid attention. They have this big wall there, brick wall, and they call it the peach wall. And I was like, why do they call that the peach wall? Like I never even like thought about it. And it's because they put the wall in to create a microclimate that's better for growing peaches, because it, you know, it's probably reflecting some heat, and you know, it's so these you can do all kinds of things to create microclimates so that you can grow things that, you know, maybe have a hardiness zone that is outside of your own hardiness zone. Or I mean, even a pond is like a microclimate. Like you've now got boggy soil, whereas somewhere else in your yard you might have really dry soil or different kind of things. That's a microclimate. You're not going to plant, you know, xeric plants in your bog garden. That would be silly. You know, you need to plant boggy plants in that. And so these are all little, you know, areas that you can create microclimates. You know, gives you all kinds of options. Some things will work in them and some things won't. So, you know, you kind of got to experiment. And to your point though, I mean, you know where I live on a hill in Harvard. At a high point, and
Pinnacle.
Exactly. The observatory is right next door. But you know, when it snows, sometimes, you know, I drive down my driveway, and if I turn right or left and go, you know, say 30 yards in either direction, the snow, you know, it might be completely white. The roads are terrible, and I get just beyond that, and suddenly there's no snow or ice on the roads at all. You know. Just the very tippy top of the hill, it's much colder where in my yard than literally the yard down the hill. You know, I can see that. I visually see it in the winter.
I find that even when I just drive from Acton into Harvard.
Right.
You know, it's like, or Littleton into Harvard. You know, like there's just a lot less snow, and you come to Harvard, and it's just.
Yeah.
I think it's just because Harvard's elevated generally, and you're way at the top. So I hear you. One of the things that I thought was really interesting and didn't really quite understand was, you know, when I'd go to the garden stores, they would recommend when you're buying plants, buy them in odd numbers for some reason. Yeah. Like don't buy even number, like if you don't buy 2 plants or 4 plants, buy 3 or 5 or 7.
So that's like that's a super common thing. You know, the 3 or 5 or 7. I mean, these are just like general guidelines that are good. I tend to explain it a little bit differently. What we like and what makes our brains make sense of compositions is repetition. So, you know, when you have 1 of something, obviously there's no repetition. 2 of something obviously starts to have the repetition, but it's 3 or more that really kind of starts to create a real pattern. So, you know, and these patterns feel better. Personally, I don't think that there's like a wildly huge difference between like 3, 4, and 5. You know, like you know, a lot of people like to say odd numbers. They do tend to work a little bit better, but you know, like 4 is fine or 6 is fine. But the other thing is that for a lot of perennials, like when I'm drawing a planting plan, literally on a piece of paper, trying to plan out, what all is going in. You're thinking about sizes, and depending on the look that you're going for, a shrub might get to be 3 by 3, 3 feet wide, and so you're kind of planning, and if you're drawing to scale, you're drawing that in a 3-foot thing, and as you're looking at this and you're imagining how this is all going to look, you may be saying, okay, like I have this shrub that's kind of, you're thinking in masses and volumes, right? It's a 3 by 3 foot thing, and then you're maybe going to have some Shasta daisies that are also, kind of adjacent. Well, the shrub is big, and the single Shasta daisy might only be like 18, 10 inches by 18 tall or something like that. Like that's not going to have the same mass, but if you put them all together, in a clump of 3 or 5. So, I tend to, this is just the way I do it when I'm drawing masses of things, like, and so like I'll have like a 3 by 3 foot shrub, like a St. John's wort or something, and I label that up, and then I have Shasta daisies, and I have some mass that I've drawn to scale, like maybe it's also 3 by 3, and then in my mind I'm going back and saying, okay, how many Shasta daisies do I need to solidly get 3 by 3 with the right spacing, and it might be 8. Or, so I kind of like backing into it, like reverse engineering it all the time, just because it's helpful to think in masses rather than, and then when you look at the landscape, this is another trick I always tell my students. If you're wondering why like your yard sort of doesn't seem to be working, or like a composition is kind of like feels messy, or doesn't look right, or you're not, whatever, close your eyes and kind of just give it a minute to just your brain to reset, and then open your eyes and look at the scene, whatever the scene is, like your yard, and notice, but be prepared to like notice what you notice first, second, third, like what literally the path of your eye is. It's probably going to be the first thing you'll notice is if you have like maybe a color red. Usually, like if you have something red, you'll notice that first, even if it's a tiny bit, and then your eye will bounce around to other things, whatever they are. And once you notice your eye path, then you can start to manipulate your eye path, and that's how you want to design it. Like, and you want to create a nice eye path, And if you have, like, say you have a bunch of yellow lilies and you have this garden bed, like if the yellow lilies are the thing you're noticing or you want to notice, you might start here, down close to the front if you're standing, and I always say, plan for the view you actually will see. So if, like, for my front yard, the view I always see that from primarily is as I arrive to my house coming up my driveway. Okay, so I want to optimize it for that. So like when I come in, I want to have a nice eye path as I look at my house, and it feels nice, and it's not like lopsided, or it's, I go from one thing to the next as I literally cluster those lilies so that, the repetition, my eye will follow that repetition, and it feels relaxing, it feels nice, it feels organized, it feels intentional, and appealing. And so that's how you think about putting that together.
Yeah, I've kind of come to that realization. I think everything I've learned is through trial and error. I think I should have taken your course 10 years ago. I would have saved like thousands and thousands of dollars. But we have so our backyard, as I said, we cleared a lot. We have a garden pretty far out from the kitchen. And that's what we look at all the time. Yeah. But it's far. So, like, after years of having the garden, and it just, I finally was honest with myself. It's like, it just doesn't look good. And what I realized was, because it's far, I need bigger plants. I need bigger things. It just looks like this conglomeration it almost looks like weeds, Yep. So I hear you. And also, the idea of repetition, again, I kind of learned that the hard way. When I went into, like, not knowing anything about gardening, it's almost like your first instinct is, like, let's just have a big variety. Let's have a lot of everything.
Or people just go to the nursery and are like, ooh, that's
one
cool.
of those,
ooh,
and one of those.
Yeah,
it's like dim sum. I want one of those and one of those. And you put them in the garden, and it's just like this big conglomeration. You don't really see anything. Because it's like one here, one here, one here, one here.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I have a design. My first design teacher in England. She called that fruit cocktail gardening.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a fruit cocktail.
Yeah. So
Exactly.
yeah, you don't want fruit cocktail gardening. But I'm thinking about your yard.
Yeah.
You can play with color too. Sometimes people want their yard to feel bigger, or maybe in your case, you want that garden that's so far away to maybe feel a little closer and not so far. And some colors recede and some kind of come at us. So like blues, for example, they will kind of create depth and make a smaller space seem bigger and make you have a more expansive feel. Whereas if you were to put something red there, like maybe you put like a big Japanese maple, like a larger one or something, or some other, bigger red kind of, it will feel like it's closer to you.
Yes.
And you'll make that whole space feel like a little cozier and more connected to
it's so funny.
Vision.
And we did not, by the way, plan this out, but we had people over a couple weeks ago, and I do have a Japanese maple that I put in that garden.
Yeah.
And one of our guests from the kitchen looked out and said, "Oh, I like that Japanese maple." It was like the only thing, that was commented on.
That you could notice on. Yeah.
And he noticed that.
Yeah.
So that was like the first of my transition of that garden. So I'm basically digging up everything.
Oh, geez.
That's what I did yesterday. I was like pulling out all the lilies.
Yeah. Yeah.
Have you ever done that? Like separate lilies?
Yeah, they're painted.
I'm sure you've done.
Like daylilies? Yeah.
Yeah, it was awful.
Yeah.
It was like.
Yeah.
So I have like this row of lilies in front. It's about 12 feet. It's like 12 plants, 12 feet. So I dug this like 12-foot ditch. I call it a ditch, but it was it was like a new path along the wood's edge. And where we live, of course, it takes like 2 days to dig 12 feet, right?
Right.
So I thought, all right, I'll separate them a little bit, put them there, and then I can move them.
Yeah.
Well, when you're separating them, I didn't realize like two of the plants filled that entire space. So I still have 10 more plants that I've got to like now relocate. So
that's when you put a thing on next door of like
exactly.
free plants at the bottom of the driveway.
But you got to dig them up yourself.
Yes.
Anyway, before we wrap up, I do want to call attention to your book, which I've referred to many, many times. It's a wonderful book. It's Cultivating Garden Style. Has not just a ton of great instruction tips on planting a garden, selecting plants, but also just beautiful photographs that just give people great ideas for gardenscapes and landscapes. So I love it. One of the things you said in it, which I love, it actually caught my attention. You say, a great garden welcomes you in the same way that a wonderful hotel sweeps you away to another place.
Yeah.
I thought it was great.
Yeah. Well, I always tell my students that gardening is really like storytelling, and the way to make a place feel good to you is that you're going to start to imprint your story onto it, and things that are important, and that may be through like sentimental plants or reminders of maybe a place that you once lived, but also the land itself is telling stories, what grows here in New England and the vernacular of this place and the history of this place will be part of it, but also like what went on before you even lived in your house on your piece of land. There's all these stories that come together, and if you seek them out and consciously kind of seek to express them, it is like a hotel. Like it sweeps you into that place. I grow peonies a lot. A lot of people grow peonies, but for me, peonies, my grandmother was a big gardener and a really important, special person to me. She had hedges of peonies in her on the ranch in Montana, at our family ranch. And it just it makes me think of her, so I kind of go a little crazy with the peonies. It's just
That's awesome.
These are stories that are, and anybody who knows me kind of knows that connection and that, but it feels good to me. It's like they bloom and I'm
like you say, it's
it's important.
It's like getting swept away to another place, like a wonderful hotel. I mean, for me, when I read that, I kind of had to laugh because when we travel, we stay in really cheap hotels. And the hotels usually have we're happy if there's no cockroaches running around the floors. And also like my kids, as you know, are very active. They're kind of monsters.
No, they're not.
Yes, they are. And when they're in hotel rooms, it's even worse.
Right,
I mean, it's like, they're like gremlins, right? So I don't have positive associations with hotels.
Yeah.
So, but now I'm glad you illuminated that a little further. So I see what you
Good
mean.
stories.
Anyway,
Good memories of hotels, I'm sure you'll have of your travel.
Anyway, you know, we're out of time, but I haven't gone through half my questions. So I'd love it if you could come back and
Sure,
because this was really wonderful.
There's
and
so many
also,
things we could talk about.
there really are, and so many that we haven't covered. So what I'd like to do is request anybody out there that has questions. You know, the show is obviously aired on cable access TV, but also on YouTube. So, you know, if anybody has any questions or comments, please include them in the comments, and then we can have Rochelle come back and answer your questions and flesh things out a little more. So, but this was wonderful. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Like I said,
It was fun.
let's do this again.
Okay.